T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Kush'S Korner here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, the coolest reptile network in the world. Solo episode tonight. I will be doing a deep dive discussion into all aspects of scrub python care, top to bottom, left to right, everything you could and anything you could ask for. It will be just a solo, like I said, so any comments, questions, participation from anyone who is watching live will be very helpful, so I'm not just an idiot rambling for an hour or two about scrub pythons, which we all know I am capable of, but probably be a little more fun with some engagement. Anyway, with all that said, before we get started, as always, USARK. So USARK is the organization that is fighting for our rights to keep our reptiles, to run our reptile businesses, and to live this lifestyle that we all cherish so much. Check out usark.org for all of the information you need to know about the organization. If you are already a member, or if you are not already a member, please look into becoming a member of USARK. When legislation hits on either a local or a national level, the number of members they can show to the legislative bodies that are trying to pass laws or are debating on whether or not to pass bills, knowing the amount of people that actually are behind the cause, who are within the industry, who love these animals and who do this for a profession, that really helps consider whether or not to pass legislation. So as USARK, as a community, we have strength in numbers. If you're not already a USARK member, please look into becoming one. Again, usark.org for all of the information you need to know. And here we are. Thank you, everybody, for being here, tuning in. Let's see, you're trying to get looks dumb. Anyway, okay, here we are. So thank you for being here, everybody. We got some people in the comments already. Much appreciated. Calvin is asking to bring back Carl. Carl was with a C. I'm not sure who Carl with a K is. So yeah, and Carl, I mean, I haven't heard from Carl in a while. He, as everyone knows, Carl was stuck in Brazil in the Amazon during COVID, and he got COVID multiple times while in Brazil, was forced to quarantine, lost his passport. It was really a quite the ordeal for Carl. Some people may say he had it coming after all the antagonistic things he said about about anyone he spoke about, but I don't know. Maybe Carl will come back one of these days. Probably to the warmest of welcomes. Anyway, with that said, thank you, Calvin, for breaking my train of concentration. For us here at the Trap Talk Reptile Network on YouTube, please subscribe, like, comment, share, hit the notification bell for all the new episodes. A new podcast drops every single day of the week here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network. Sometimes even 2 podcasts a day on the rare occasion. And hosting these podcasts are some of the absolute best in the business, covering a wide variety of topics with some of the absolute best guests you can ask for. I mean, I'm very proud to be a part of what's going on here at the Trap Talk Reptile Network, and it really is very cutting edge in the industry as far as kind of the history of how information is spread about reptiles, about the industry, about conservation, about whatever there is to be talked about here on the channel. So very much appreciate everybody who has been along for the ride. Anyone who's new, welcome. We are happy you are here. If you are an audio only person, which is who I am most of the time, I love to put on a podcast while I'm doing work or at the gym or whatever. We are also on all of the available audio platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Buzzsprout, etc. A follow, subscribe, or a 5-star review on any of those platforms would be most appreciated. And yeah, that is all I have to say for the time being. So to get into the discussion on scrub python care, I will be consulting my little note list that I made for myself throughout the evening. I guess I'll start by saying scrub python care, to sum up a whole episode in a few words, is pretty easy, generally speaking. They are very resilient. Part of why I enjoy working with them so much. They're hardy. They can exist in a lot of different conditions and thrive. So, with that said, for anyone who is interested in scrub pythons who doesn't already keep them, don't let that be a factor that deters you from them. That is probably one of the easiest parts of getting into scrub pythons. I would say some of the bigger ones to overcome would be their size, and then the bad reputation that they've developed over time, which if you've been following what I've been doing for any amount of time, you know that that's one of my main goals within my work with scrub pythons, is to kind of, prove wrong the reputation that they have gained over time. If you see any of my videos or my posts on social media, I intentionally do most of them with the animals in my hands so that, it's hard to fake that. If the animal is not happy and doesn't want you to be handling it, it's not just going to be sitting in your hand nice and chill. So, but anyway, with that said, the first aspect of scrub python care is, the very basic initial aspect, which is temperature and humidity. Kind of the first thing that you kind of need to have right with almost any reptile. And what's great about scrub pythons is that it's pretty straightforward and falls in line with almost all the other python species, I guess probably, minus Boelen's pythons. So there are two different approaches. Most people, especially if you have a smaller collection or only a couple animals, you don't have a dedicated reptile room. Maybe you're in an apartment and you cannot keep that animal at ambient temperature. So I am in a house right now, but based on how I have rooms set up, I'm kind of doing it different ways in different rooms. So I do have one room, actually the room I'm in right now, that does just sit at room temperature most of the time. Being that I'm in West Texas, room temperature in the summer can sometimes be 82 if you don't want your electric bill to be staggering at the end of the month. So come summertime, I will actually adjust this room to be on a little bit more of an ambient schedule, but then it'll still drop down lower at night than the rest of the rooms will during the summer. So anyway, with that said, though, in this room, I have hotspots on all of my reptiles tuned up to different degrees. Generally speaking, for any scrub python that is not a breeding female, nothing wrong with like an 86-degree hotspot. You don't really need to go much above that. A little below, that's probably fine too. But if you're in a room temperature room, if it's sitting in low to mid 70s, giving that snake the opportunity to get into the mid 80s will be good for thermoregulation, for gestation, for or digestion. Sorry, not gestation, and well, that as well, but digestion will be most useful for that. And I currently am doing that in these cages, as you can see up there, with radiant heat panels, and I'll be. Well, I guess I can just discuss this now. There is definitely quite a debate on radiant heat panels versus light bulbs. And frankly, I have radiant heat panels because I bought a bunch of radiant heat panels when I got all my cages. And in hindsight, I'm not sure if I would have made that decision again. With that said, though, you can definitely make a radiant heat panel work well. You just have to treat it a little bit differently than a light bulb. So with the panels, they're all controlled by herpstats. And typically speaking, if it's not a breeder female, I have that panel set to about from 84 to 86, kind of depending on where it sits in the room, for about 12 hours on, 12 hours off during the day, with a 45-minute ramping period. So in the morning and in the evening, they're not just getting a sudden jolt of heat. But then again, obviously, that's not as natural of a cycle as they could possibly get. But obviously, we are in captivity, so things don't always work exactly as they would in the wild. And you have to take that into consideration as well. Trying to replicate wild conditions to a T, will oftentimes lead you to a place of doing something wrong. I mean, frankly, if you were trying to do that for scrub pythons, you would end up with soupy, moldy cages trying to replicate the amount of rainfall that they can get in certain times of the year. It's just totally unfeasible unless you live somewhere like, Homestead, Florida, or south, where you could keep these snakes outside almost year round, have a drainage system and an outdoor screen enclosure, and then most of the scrub pythons aren't even legal to keep in Florida in the first place. So, with that said, kind of if anyone here is listening from parts of Australia or Indonesia or whatever, then you can think about really replicating natural cycles. But otherwise, we kind of are dealing with what we can in captivity, balancing caring for the snake in a natural way, and then in a way that's functional and healthy for the animal in the captive setting. I have found that cycle with the heat panels works pretty well. They're not big baskers for extended periods of time, really, no matter what you give them, at least from what I have found. They'll go there for the amount of time they need to be there, and then they'll head down, they'll go hide, they'll sit in the cold end, they'll cruise around a bit. So they're very good at regulating themselves from a temperature standpoint. If you were to have a bulb in an enclosure, then you have to manage your setup a little bit differently. For anyone who's watching on the video, as you can see on the cages behind me, I have shelves in my enclosures, and I can get into that in a little bit as well about cage decor. But with that said, the combination of a shelf and a radiant heat panel it's pretty ideal for a scrub python. Scrub pythons will perch. They'll perch similar to green tree pythons or emerald tree boas, and but they'll also drape across branches as well. That's another behavior that they often like to do, and they'll take advantage of these shells for that. So they'll either coil themselves under the heat panel directly. Sometimes I'll see them sit kind of next to the panel with like a coil or two of their body actually under the panel, which is pretty interesting, or kind of line themselves across the back of the enclosure with I think that these different basking behaviors aren't somewhat intentional. Figuring out exactly what's intentional in which situation, that's going to take some time and ultimately some guesswork to really find out. One thing that I will say about heat panels that I have figured out, for anyone watching the videos, the smaller the heat panels, the better. You kind of get closer to a spot of sun or a light bulb in an enclosure. I've found that the larger heat panels are just, they're fine for keeping an ambient in an enclosure. But if you have a female who is basking for, while she's gravid or developing follicles in particular, I don't think it is the most effective means of basking. And it's definitely not the most natural, where, based on the information that I've been able to gather over the years of researching scrub pythons, and then also from just observations I've made of my own animals while I've been breeding them, I would assume that more often than not, these guys are getting kind of near the edge of the trees where there may be breaks in the foliage and putting part of their body in a spot that's getting direct sun, heating up the follicles, and then retreating back under the canopy where it's going to be a cooler, more even temperature. So obviously, if their entire body is fully under a heat panel at an even flat temperature all the way across, I just think that's as far from a natural basking structure as you can get in a captive setting. Obviously, I have some panels that are like that in some of my female cages. I've kind of been figuring this out as I go. So those will be set to a lower temperature than some of these smaller panels that I have. The smaller panels you can make warmer to have more of a concentrated hot spot. So where they could do that single coil basking behavior where they keep the rest of their body off the hot spot and just put a coil or two in the into the basking area, and be there for a shorter period of time, leave, go back underneath the box, etc., or into their nest box or their hide. So Brandon comments, small ones are pumping out more heat. What do you mean by that exactly? Like from like an electrical standpoint, or I want to know exactly what your point is there, Brandon, just before I comment on it. Whether this is for the snakes or for your energy bill, I guess. So anyway, back to what I was saying. So I'll talk more about the panels and bulbs in a little bit. But as far as just purely achieving that temperature goes, you can do it really with anything. I have some bigger panels and cages with my males, and I'll just have them set to a lower temperature just to achieve that ambient in the enclosure that I want. Males won't really directly bask very often at all, if really even ever. So for them, I'm treating it much more of a panel creating an ambient temperature in an enclosure compared to a panel creating a hotspot. And with that said, that's a good transition, I think, to the topic of ambient keeping. In my opinion, keeping reptiles, or okay, now I'm going to say not reptiles, keeping most snakes on a straight ambient temperature is probably the the best way to do things for a number of reasons. One, I think that in the captive setting, I think most snakes will thrive better that way, even though it is kind of counterintuitive to what you would think in the wild. Just considering, obviously, in nature, temperatures will fluctuate rather frequently, but in captivity, I've kept, at this point, hundreds of species in many different ways, and by a long shot, my favorite way is to do straight ambient in rooms. Not only do I think it's better for the snakes themselves, and then I guess put a little asterisk on this, not completely when it comes to breeding, but as far as keeping up until the point of females breeding, I think ambient is the complete way to go if you can. If you can't, it's not that big of a deal. That's why I'm doing this episode, to kind of give a few different options as to how you can take care of these animals. With that said, though, if you can do an ambient room, you're going to be set. Your electric bill, you might not have a crazy bill from running a bunch of panels and lights, heat tape, etc. But really, more than that, the biggest thing is safety. Obviously, we're all reptile keepers. We have heat mats and panels, light bulbs, thermostats. We have extension cords, all that stuff. And, knock on wood for everybody who has been fine so far. But there's always worst case scenario. And when you're running an ambient room where it's just one flat temperature for the entire room, controlled by a mini split or a window unit, or even a central HVAC unit, your risk factor is decreased to very close to zero, especially if you have your equipment professionally installed. So, properly ventilated rooms, it's, as long as you don't make some very shocking mistake in the installation of your units, you're in a really safe situation for those animals. And in my opinion, you're not compromising the care in the slightest. If anything, you're actually improving the care. With that said, I guess before I get to that, I want to get back to Brandon's comment. So more surface area, more energy. Sure. Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of that, trying to find the happy middle ground of figuring out what's best for the animals and also kind of good for you and your wallet and your electric bill. And then kind of also just the nature of how your enclosure is set up as well. So anyway, with ambient keeping, kind of the way to do it that has been tried and true for years is essentially, a room at 80 degrees, give or take a couple of degrees in either direction, 77 by the lowest at night, 83 at the hot end during the day. If it varies a little bit one way or another, that's not that big of a deal. But if you're set right around that 80-degree mark, you really can't go wrong. And this works for most reptile or most snake species, be it most colubrids, most pythons and boas, arboreal stuff, terrestrial stuff, ball pythons. You're going to get most species to thrive at those temperatures. Obviously, there's some higher elevation snakes like my montane rattlesnakes and vipers that I keep, or from a Boyd standpoint, Madagascar tree boas, Boland's pythons, the handful of species that do exist in colder climates or in higher elevation. There's some Asian colubrids like the Porphyracia complex that like it cooler, mandarin rat snakes, stuff like that. Aside from some of those species, most species are pretty good at these temperature parameters and will breed at these temperature parameters as well. The only difference would be obviously providing supplemental heat onto females that are developing follicles and then obviously that are gravid. I still like to give that night drop where you cut the heat or at least turn it down significantly. just so that, it's a more natural cycle. I've done it both ways, where I've had I've had the panels on 24/7 with the gravid female, or I've done it where they cut off at night. And I've found that I run into issues when I had them on 24/7. I had females laying early, potential egg binding issues from doing that. And honestly, for me, this was quite like the learning experience within reptiles. A lot of us, when we get into it, as I did and many people on here probably did as well, ball pythons were the gateway drug, so to speak. And a lot of the, the dogma, so to speak, of ball python keeping is, in the CB70 tub with the flex watt at the back set to 90 or whatever. And then, that hotspot just runs 24/7. So I had my rack set like that. And then when I got cages, I just figured I'd do them the exact same way. Obviously not with that hot of a hotspot running 24/7, but still nonetheless. And then eventually one day it just clicked. I'm like, why am I doing this? This is wasteful and not natural for the snakes and probably causing me issues. So stopped doing that, and then pretty quickly saw a significant improvement in basically every single way possible with the animals. So let me take a quick swig. So the topic of humidity with scrub pythons is really a pretty easy one. They're very resilient, as I was saying earlier, to a lot of different care parameters. I don't, I don't really monitor humidity. I have gauges in my rooms that read temperature and humidity. I don't quite as much pay attention to the humidity on a regular basis. With that said, though, they need humidity. They don't do well when they're dry. But obviously, based on how you set up enclosures, you can monitor, you can handle it in different ways. I would just generally say that 50 to 75% or so, 80% is a good range. You naturally want humidity fluctuation with, I think, almost any reptile. Personally, that's my opinion on it. And then from a functionality standpoint, if you have a room too humid, you're going to develop mold. Your enclosures will get moldy. If you have a very humid room, plus low, minimally ventilated enclosures, plus spraying, you're definitely going to get mold in your enclosures. So that's why I'd say I don't really go too much on the ambient humidity reading, especially we're reading general humidity, and there's a whole other discussion that I'm not qualified to have on how to actually calculate humidity. I had somebody message me one time that I forget exactly what kind of work they did, but they worked with, in homes, and said that, ambient humidity and then specific humidity, I think was the term, are very different things. And that's what we really should be looking at. It was kind of like, huh? Like I never even heard of this until this person mentioned it to me. So different topic for another day. With that said, though, generally speaking, if you're getting good sheds from your scrub pythons, you're doing just fine. That's kind of the general rule of thumb for me. I've kept scrub pythons both ways, where I spray them or where I don't spray them at all. And I don't think one way is necessarily better than the other. I think spraying just offsets a potential, a drier climate. So like when I was living in the Midwest, I really didn't spray my my scrub pythons much at all, if not ever, depending on the room that they were in. And now that I'm essentially living in the desert, I have to spray my scrub pythons or they would have hydration issues. So depending on the time of the year and if I'm cycling them in different aspects, I'll spray them, once a week, sometimes 3 times a week, which is what I'm doing currently. So, if you were living on the East Coast, you might not need to spray your scrub pythons quite so much if naturally your rooms are staying more humid. If you're obviously in Florida, probably not as much of a concern. But if you're out here on the West Coast, maybe it is more of a concern for you. If you're further out in Central Texas to where I am, it might not be so much of a concern for you. So it's kind of to me, a play it by ear kind of situation, or by your, observation of the animal. If they look hydrated, if their skin is good, if their eyes are clear, they're shedding well, you're doing fine. If they're having bad sheds, if you can tell that their nasal tract is clogged up by, old sheds that are stuck or whatever like that, another sign things aren't going well. I've definitely seen dehydrated scrub pythons, and they have a look to them. They almost kind of get like a weird sheen to them, and they look a little sunken a bit. So definitely, if you get to that point, you need to help your snake out, whether that be, increase numbers of soaks for smaller periods of time, or work on your ambient humidity in your room. So like for instance, for me and my setup, I have animals that are in my house and my garage as well. And anything that's in the actual house itself where the HVAC system is working, it really never gets so dry that I feel like I really need a humidifier in the room, where supplemental spraying does more than the trick. But in my garage, if I didn't have my humidifier running in there, I would be in serious trouble. And I was in serious trouble early on when I moved into the house and was setting up the garage. When I mentioned a second ago about seeing dehydrated scrub pythons, it was from when I was first moving my animals out into the garage after we'd gotten it finished up. And, without any sort of supplemental humidity, it was 10% humidity at best in there. And that wasn't definitely not going to cut it. So I do have a humidifier that I run in there, and it's on pretty consistently to try to maintain about a 50% ambient humidity in the room. So, sometimes I have it set wrong, and I walk in the morning and it's like walking into a cloud, and I'm like, I look at my sensor and it says 75, 80% humidity. I'm like, okay, I got to air out the room for a second. But I bet the snakes like that in small doses. Hit a couple of questions. So Alex, yeah, I probably so. He asked if I will attempt to set up some enclosures with light bulbs in the future. I think I could definitely see myself doing that, especially with some taller enclosures. The main issue that I have, which I was going to mention earlier, and then I didn't as part of my rambling, but Alex, we've definitely talked about this before, is the way that my enclosures are oriented with the shelves. A heat panel is, for anyone watching the video, you're only getting a very short distance from the top of the enclosure to the bottom of the panel. That allows a larger area for that heat to kind of disperse a bit before you reach the shelf where the snake is going to be. Well, you put a bulb in there and you're immediately going like 4 inches closer to the shelf. So just by the way these are set up, it would almost be impossible for me to use bulbs for basking unless I added another area for them to sit and have the bulb more kind of towards the front of the enclosure. So it would take some messing around with the actual setup itself. It's definitely doable, but the shelf does create a bit of an obstacle from the standpoint of having enclosures with light bulbs. One thing I actually, I could do, just kind of spitballing, and Alex, you might have some more thoughts on this than I do, would even be to mount like a light fixture underneath the shelf in a tall cage, maybe not in these 4x2x2s, but in like a 3-foot tall cage, and actually create a basking spot underneath it. I don't know if you want to give me your thoughts on that here. Maybe we can just talk about this some other time. But yeah, definitely in the future, I would love to do light bulbs. Airflow help with humidity. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, that's the name of the game with it. Obviously, if you get to a point where you have so much moisture in the air and in your room, no amount of airflow is really gonna prevent mold buildup. But definitely, yeah, air exchange, airflow, opening a window if you can, opening some doors up, having fans in the room, but to a certain degree. I've seen people go so crazy with fans where like you walk into their room and you can't even hear yourself think because the fans are so loud. I think there's only very few reptile species in the world in general that kind of need like wind, so to speak. But not probably much of what we are working with. Definitely not scrub pythons. Yeah, no, Brandon, I never got that humidifier. I ended up just getting some like cheapo one off of Amazon that was like a quarter of the price of that one. I don't know. Maybe if scrub pythons become the next retic, I'll be able to get your bougie ass humidifier. Let's see. So you're in Australia, but down south. Yeah, exactly. So it's knowing your climate. And, I've never been to Australia, but I'll take your word that down south is drier. It kind of makes sense based on my rudimentary knowledge of Australian geography. But yeah, it's all about just kind of knowing your circumstance and kind of playing with things until it works. I'm out in the desert where our ambient humidity most of the time is under 20%. And I've found ways to have my rooms get to the point where they're kind of resembling what they were back in Indiana or Chicago, where certain seasons, your outside humidity can be 60 to 80% pretty much constantly. So that was, much less of a concern there. So Paul, yeah, exactly. So that's good to know that, you can do that with the panel under the shelves as well. But yeah, the bulbs in the 24 enclosures are difficult. I mean, without a shelf, I could see it being doable. The other thing is to, get a bulb that is, I guess, weak enough to not overpower your enclosure. I've definitely had that happen to me, especially with LED or, like T5 fixtures that I wasn't expecting to emit as much heat as they did. And I just frankly couldn't use them because they would keep an ambient temperature in the enclosure at like 94 degrees. And I'm like, this is terrible for this animal. So yeah, it's definitely, it's finding a balance, and that's a lot easier to do with the panels that, you can just regulate easily on a thermostat. Obviously you can regulate a bulb on a thermostat too, but once you get into the lighting aspect as well, I personally feel like having a light flicking on and off all day with the temperature would probably be a little strange for the snake, but who am I to say? I've never done it and I've never been a snake. So I can't speak to that one. Okay, well, I guess that's the next thing I have on my list. So I will talk about it. Lighting. So for lighting, I really think it comes down ultimately to us as the keeper. And I really don't think the snakes care all that much. There's, obviously UVB lighting is quite the topic these days, and I'll get into that a bit as far as my thoughts on UVB with scrub pythons. But it's from like an LED lighting standpoint, I like using them because I like how it looks. I like looking at my snakes, but I always think about it from the perspective of, if I was a nocturnal animal in that enclosure, would I enjoy having this bright ass light on me all day? And it makes me think sometimes whether or not the lights are actually for them or if they're really just for us. And I don't think that it's a bad thing. People have been keeping snakes with UV or with LED lights for decades and decades, and obviously the snakes have been just fine. I would just say to try to not use a super overpowering LED light. And if you're in a 4-foot enclosure, maybe have that LED light, like a 2.5 foot or a 2 foot LED strip, just so that there's still some areas in the enclosure that the animal can escape to, create some shadows, etc. And they're not just like, on an operating table staring up and, the lights are so bright that you don't even know what's going on. That's kind of what I imagine that these snakes are seeing during the day sometimes in these really bright lit up enclosures. I do have some enclosures that I don't have lights in at all, whether it be because the snakes have decided to, explore too much and break their light, or what I was saying about some of the UVB like T5 fixtures that I was using, that they were overpowering the enclosure with too much heat. And on some of my breeder females that I want to have at a pretty specific temperature range, those lights just were too much of a variable in that equation for me. So I just decided to cut them off altogether. And, frankly, I'll see the snakes out a little bit more during the day. Obviously, there's still room lights that they get a 12 on, 12 off cycle, or a little less in the winter. So they're still getting a photo period. They're just not getting that light quite as directly onto them. And I think they respond just as well. And maybe you can even make a case for even better than if that light was directly in the enclosure as well. Kind of what I was saying earlier, where I personally believe that in the wild, these snakes, especially the ones that are in Papua New Guinea and the islands that are more rainforest type of habitat, they're probably not getting direct sun all that often. They're probably spending a lot of time under canopy, which, if you think about it from our, very removed captive scenario, if you're a snake in a glass front PVC cage that allows for as much light to get in as is possible, if you don't have any lights in there as the snake, but the lights that are outside of your enclosure are going through a natural cycle, it's probably not too dissimilar to being a snake that spends a majority of its time under the canopy in the rainforest. So I still feel comfortable saying that that's a photo period for my snake. I see them, acting accordingly, especially as it coincides with their basking period. So I think that is a good way to do it. Does not look nearly as good, I will give you all that. I wish that some of these enclosures had LEDs in them that didn't emit heat like those T5 fixtures do, so that I could see the snakes more often. And, probably inevitably when I move the cages around, I'll probably install some when that time comes. But for now, that is a kind of a hard thing to do with how my room is set up. So not to kind of divert into that. Water break or a body armor break. With how much of these I drink on the show, Body Armor better sponsor this freaking channel. They've been getting a lot of free publicity. So anyway, the topic of UVB lighting. I don't know how I feel about UVB lighting for most reptiles in general. I think that people who want to use UV for their snakes comes from a great place. And I commend that. I commend anybody who wants to do better by their animals, provide better care, do things to better preserve the longevity of the animal, have them in the most healthy, natural state possible. All great. For me, the jury is still out on UV lighting, whether or not that actually makes a real difference in the animal. I personally think that nutrition is by a factor of 1,000, maybe even more important than lighting for reptiles. And frankly, in the snake field, there's not a whole lot of that being pushed because there are not products to sell for snakes that promote nutrition. Rodents that you get from any online supplier, or really probably almost all of your local breeders, they're fed a commercial diet that's a derivative of a diet formulated for the rodent lab industry, which for anyone who hasn't already watched it, the episode that Dave Levinson did, I believe it was last Friday, with Krista, Mark Bailey, and Emilio, talking about the whole Chinese rodent thing that's been going around Facebook lately. It was a tremendous episode for anybody who is unaware of the truth of how rodents work in the US. I'd greatly recommend checking out that episode because, they shed great light on the topic. They weren't biased about anything. It wasn't slamming Chinese rodents because, frankly, that is not the problem. It was a tremendous conversation. With all that said, though, these commercial diets that were made for the laboratory industry, they were made for rodent growth, not for nutritional value of that rodent. It was, how do I get this rat from a baby to 100 grams so we can test on it as efficiently as possible in a way that we can formulate for every single animal to eliminate this variable in our experiment. So with that said, you're kind of feeding a relatively empty vessel within reason to your snake when you're feeding a commercially produced rodent, or a rodent from China, or a rodent that originated in a rodent lab, or whatever it may be. So with lizards and with amphibians and whatnot, there are a lot of commercial supplements that are made by, companies like Repashy that are wonderful, and they're, very scientific formulations that, that have been studied. They're well known. If you look at the ingredients, that you can see that there are a lot of very beneficial things in there, but those aren't marketed really towards snakes. And to me, what's the purpose of this UV light that is supposed to help with the synthesis of these vitamins and minerals and micronutrients when you're not even giving the snakes those nutrients to begin with? It's like you're synthesizing nothing. You're synthesizing whatever they would get from their bones, from the rodent's bones, or I mean, the very minimal to non-existent gut flora that they'd be taking in from that rodent. So to me, doing something like what we talked about last week with Terry Cullen of supplementing your rodents with, with pink Himalayan salt or Gaelic salt and kelp powder every month and a half or so, I personally think has more potential long-term benefits to snakes than UVB lighting. That's just my personal belief. And I just haven't seen enough real data in snakes to tell me for sure one way or another on UV lighting. I've used it on plenty of snakes, tons of scrub pythons, rattlesnakes, etc. And the only thing that I have ever seen that I've gotten out of it is UV burns, which is user error on my part. That isn't necessarily the fault of the bulb itself, but that's all I can really say that I've seen different one way or another. No increase in breeding behavior, no difference in regular day-to-day behavior, day to night. I think that has a lot more to do with availability and temperature of their basking spot compared to particular type of lighting available. So just kind of my thoughts on that. I'm not trying to discourage anybody from using UV lighting. I'm just giving you my 2 cents on the issue. And frankly, when you're someone like me with as large of a collection, as quite the financial burden to use UV lighting on your animals. And with that said, if it was very cut and dry proven that would be a good thing, I would definitely look into it. But without my anecdotal evidence to say that it's a good thing, and without like real data in front of me that says you should do this, go for it, this is not something that I really am going to pursue. So again, just kind of not trying to persuade anybody one way or another, just kind of give my personal thoughts and experience on it. And once again, trying to preach what I think is the most important aspect of reptile care, which is nutrition, and one that we overlook a lot. Let's see. And yeah, so Mason, exactly, like right here, feeding a varied diet. Obviously, if you're feeding, like exactly what you listed off there, rodents, chicks, quail, eggs, and then Reptilinks, especially with a product like Reptilinks, when, they're mixing up all different kinds of stuff in there, whole prey in there, different, I think there's some that have like fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. Then you're getting that variety of micronutrient content of vitamins and minerals, and that is what I think is really important to the longevity of these animals. And yeah, obviously with lizards, and that's why I think that a great aspect of podcasts like this and the ones on this channel is you can hear different things that people working with reptiles that are entirely different than yours are doing. Like with lizards, you take some of the information about variety and diet and supplementation with lizards and apply it to snakes, and your snakes will be much better off for it. Obviously, this is not a pushed thing in snakes because so far there is not a financial incentive behind it for some of these larger corporations that are, involved in our industry. So, you just have people like me yelling on a podcast on a Wednesday night about it, more or less. So, but I guess to explain a little bit about what I do from the nutrition standpoint, I'm going to start doing some of that supplementation stuff that we talked about last week with Terry. That's part of the reason why I love having Terry on the podcast and talking to him, is because, I'd have never met anybody who knows nearly as much about reptile nutrition as he does. And I want to, for myself, get as much of that information as possible to apply to my collection, and then, have it on the internet for years to come for anyone else who, could benefit from it as well. But the main thing that I do is, for one, here, Brooke and I, we breed our own rodents, and, mice and African soft furs. So rats, I still have to buy a decent amount of, the bigger sizes. But, anything that eats a mouse, or basically anything that's like a small rat size and down, gets an in-house produced rodent that is fed a naturalistic diet with, different seeds, fruits and vegetables, different grains as well, soldier fly larvae, mealworms, stuff like that, stuff like carrots and blueberries, lots of different foods that have different micronutrient contents, et cetera, et cetera. They get grass, they get hay. So that's what I can do personally to impact the health of my snakes, is to know exactly what I'm putting into them from a feeder standpoint, because I'm feeding the feeders. So I know that, I'm in a very fortunate situation where I I do this for a living, and have, frankly, based on that, the time to put specificity into the diets of my animals via breeding my own feeders. It's not for everybody. It's kind of gross, but I've done it on a pretty massive scale. So having, 26 tubs in a closet is light work for me. But with that said, I know it's not for everybody. If you are even slightly open to it, though, there is literally nothing in the entire realm of herpetoculture that I could recommend more to a snake keeper than breeding your own rodents. It is the absolute single number one best thing you could do for your reptiles. I also want to put this comment up because I could be putting out an idea that can get stolen. But yes, Paul, I think that for anyone who's in the live chat now, we can see the comment. You see that trend in dog food in particular, cat food, small animal food, of of a naturalistic diet for these animals, getting away from the kibble type of thing. And that's essentially what we feed our snakes now, is more or less snake kibble, from what are these rodents are. I really haven't put that two and two together until now on that, but truly that's what our rodents are fed, and therefore that's what the snakes get. And a lot of our rodent food is processed in the same exact facilities that produce the dog chow, the shitty dog chow that sits on, that can sit on a shelf for a year and still be edible. So, take that into consideration when you are feeding your animals. There's obviously a lot of talk these days about highly processed foods in humans. And, the way that I see it, these snakes are a whole heck of a lot smaller than us. So for as much of that food as we can handle, they can probably handle a whole lot less of that. I think leading to early cancer in reptiles, heart conditions, organ failure, et cetera, et cetera. This is not the topic of the conversation. It is, kind of, it's relevant, but I definitely got into a bit of a rant. Thank you for this question, Mason, because this kind of can bring me back to earth a little bit. Just to kind of recap from earlier, I kind of gave two different takes on it, both on an ambient only standpoint, and then if you are forced to do supplemental heating, whether you're, if you have that animal in a room that's at room temperature. I think ambient is the best for them. If you can have an ambient room of approximately 80 degrees, 77 to 83 or so, that's up until the point of breeding. I think that is absolutely the best for them. If you are doing a supplemental heating type of structure, like I'm doing in this room I'm currently in, if you're sitting low to mid 70s during the day, a hot spot around 86 degrees or so is what I think is best for about 12 hours of the day. And then just to recap humidity as well, I said like 50 to 75%, more or less. You have to kind of gauge it based on where you live, the ambient temperature or humidity in your house, and then also the type of enclosure you're in as well. But the general rule of thumb, really for all snakes, but for scrub pythons for sure, is how are the sheds looking that you're getting for the animal? Does their skin look healthy? Are their eyes looking good? Is everything, if everything's working well from that standpoint, then you're probably doing just fine from the humidity. So to get back to my, okay, here we go. Next topic is enclosure size. Definitely a hot topic within scrub pythons, and for good reason. The one thing I'll say to preface this is that scrub pythons are fairly active as far as pythons go, particularly the males, and they will use the space you give them. So don't ever be afraid to go bigger with your scrub pythons, because it's certainly not going to hurt them. With that said, though, I'll kind of go through a bit of how I do things as a breeder, and then break down how you can do them as a keeper if you want to have a smaller collection of scrub pythons or reptiles in general. So when I hatch out a clutch of scrub pythons, the babies go into 6-quart tubs. First thing, kind of standard setup. At least until they're eating consistently, I keep them on paper towels, just so I can really monitor how everything is going for them. Water bowl, hide, pretty standard. And then, I'll also use some of the 3D printed perches like you can get from our wonderful sponsor, the Reptile perch here. So another plug for them. They're a great company. I've used their products for years. Forgot to put the ticker up for the episode anyway. So keep them like that in an ambient room, like I was saying. And then as soon as they get a little bit of size on them, they're eating well to the point where I open the tub on feeding day. They can smell the feeders in the air in the room, and they're on it. They're no hesitation. Then if I'm able to, I upgrade them to a 15-quart tub or so, probably about twice the volume of a 6-quart tub. I mean, just based on the quart size, more than double the actual volume of the tub. And then they stay in there for a bit longer as well. Kind of depends on the growth rate of the snake as well. But with that said, you can move them up sooner or have them in a bigger enclosure. I think at this point, once the scrub python is to the point where they're eating with really no hesitation, they're not nervous at all, they can probably go into a cage and do just fine. So to kind of bring it back, for anyone who watched my episode with Paul Duran on here or any of the other podcasts that he has done, him and then also Alexandra, who breeds scrub pythons as well, they raise their babies communally in larger bioactive setups with great success. So it can be done a multitude of ways. That way obviously will take a lot of specific attention, making sure that you actually are keeping track of which animal is which one is getting food. If you see one that's not doing as well as the others, pulling it out or putting it in a different enclosure. But it's definitely doable. You just have to be a lot more on top of it. Kind of the same thing with the bioactive versus sterile keeping debate. If you're keeping bioactive, that's awesome, more power to you, but you just have to be on top of some of the potential complications that come along with that style of keeping. And the same thing goes for with scrub pythons, whether you're doing bioactive or just a naturalistic setup. If you're keeping them in a larger space, you just need to observe different things that come along with that. Kind of to go back. So yeah, Lisa, what do you think about feeding live or fresh killed once in a while? I think fresh killed is the best way to feed reptiles. The freezing process of rodents does degrade some of the nutritional benefit of that animal. So I think that if you are able to, as a keeper, procure fresh killed rodents, I think that is the absolute best way to feed reptiles. I hate feeding live personally. Really anything that's over that's weaned off of the mom, just because they can do serious damage to the snake. I'll feed live if I have to. If a snake isn't going to take anything other than alive, then sure. But I do it as absolutely minimally as possible. For a fresh born baby scrub python, I'll throw a live fuzzy mouse in there so that the movement can get their attention. Or if they're going to take a little, they're a bit shy or nervous about me looming over them while I'm feeding them, they can eat that mouse overnight when they feel more comfortable, when the room is quiet. But yeah, I don't like feeding live to anything that's weaned off the mom and that has the ability to do serious damage to the snake. But yeah, I think fresh killed is the absolute best way to go if you can, just to get the absolute maximal nutritional value derived from that prey item. And then, yeah, this is a great point as well on live plants. You can't go wrong with live plants. Live plants are, they're plants. They do what they do. They create oxygen. Lots of plants are antimicrobials, yada yada yada. Can't go wrong with that. So if you want to, put live plants in your enclosures, great, go ahead. Scrub pythons, while they're a larger python, I personally have yet to keep live plants in my scrub enclosures, but I have friends who do and do it very successfully. I believe, Paul, if you're still here, I believe you do have live plants in your enclosures. And maybe if you want to throw the species down that you have in there, they're great, but scrub pythons are not nearly as destructive as burms, retics, etc. So I think that keeping live plants in your scrub python enclosures is most certainly a very doable thing. And very beneficial as well. So anyway, back to the topic of enclosure size. Again, for me personally, once they've kind of outgrown that 15 quart tub size, for me as a breeder, as somebody who has a larger amount of them, that's kind of roughly the time when they're about to be eating medium mice. And then I'll move them to a 28 quart tub as well. So again, essentially doubling the volume of that enclosure. And then I think that that's a pretty good size where you can comfortably have that snake for a little while. Again, this is also the point in time where you could 100% put the snake in a cage, and it will probably thrive in that environment as long as you have all the parameters right, and then probably provide a little bit of additional cover for the snake so it isn't just completely exposed out in the open, small snake in a big cage. But also have them at tubs at this size. And then the last tub size that I will upgrade them to is the Freedom Breeder FB80 tub, which is essentially the same exact dimension as a CB70 tub, which we all know, just about another inch or two in height. So obviously not quite like an arboreal tub by any means, but just a little bit of extra height that I think they're, just makes them a little bit more comfortable in that area. You're not just compressing them into this short tub that's essentially made for a ball python. And then from there, when they're at that point, obviously, like I've been saying, they can go into, and yeah, Katie, this is a great point. For those of you who don't know Logger is absolutely a large adult scrub python. Maybe digging out the pothos plant, maybe you've given that snake too much time to learn how to how to destroy its setup. And either way, I think it's definitely the way to go, and that's adding a little extra dose of enrichment to that animal's enclosure as well. And they can learn how to garden, apparently. So that's cool. Another check mark in the box of scrub python intelligence is that they can they can become gardeners, apparently. Pretty cool. Might need to see that for myself one day. So the smallest enclosure size that I personally use are 2-foot cubes. And okay, so clarification, in the room, not just the enclosure. Yeah, right, exactly the same thing. More plants the better in the room, in the enclosure. It's all great. So the 2-foot cube enclosures that I use, I think they're an incredible size. They're very space efficient, but they're, with the cubic nature of them, they're larger enclosures than you would give them credit for. And they can potentially house a fairly decent sized scrub python. If you need to do a temporary measure for a bigger snake, they can be in that enclosure for a period of time fairly comfortably. You can have a young animal in that enclosure potentially for even a couple of years as they grow up if you start them in very small. So I think the 2x2x2 cubic enclosure size is one of the absolute best and most versatile for these snakes. I have my 3x2x2 enclosures as well, which obviously is just one step above that. And then the smallest enclosures that I have for my animals that I consider adults are 4x2x2. And, obviously this is probably the most classic and most, versatile size for a reptile enclosure ever. I'll keep my smaller species of scrub pythons like halmaheras and tannenbars and whatnot in this size of enclosure, and then smaller adult amethystina, clastolepis, whatnot in these enclosures as well. And they do well in these cages. They're a good size to where you can breed them in these cages effectively by, like these ones behind me are 4x2x2, where you can have a hot spot that doesn't overpower a cage to where the cool side can still stay at ambient room temperature. You're really able to play with some of the dynamics within that enclosure. I think it's a great enclosure size as well. And then I have 5x2x2 enclosures, 6x2x2 enclosures. The cages that I like to use for my adult breeders are 6 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 2.5 feet tall. And I like these for a number of reasons. I think they're very functional for me, and they're also great for the snakes as well. Personally, with scrub pythons with height, they'll use all the height you give them. So I personally think that 6 inches or a foot of difference one way or another is probably not going to have the largest effect on them possible from a care standpoint. A 1 foot enclosure is just beyond terrible. Please, please, please don't keep a big scrub python in a 1 foot tall enclosure. But you can set up a 2 foot tall enclosure to have a decent amount of climbing space in it. Whether you use shelves, perches, a combination of that, logs, branches. You can really make a good arboreal setup within a 2 foot tall enclosure. And then that extra 6 inches of height in the adult cages just creates for that much more potential of what you can do with that space. Why I like that size so much is that I can triple stack them in my room and comfortably work all 3 cages. I'm on the taller side of the human spectrum, so that works for me just, because I'm the height I am. So that might not be the most functional for some people, but for the snakes, it works great as well. And I can fit just that many more in my room in cages that I do feel comfortable having them in. When people ask me about adult scrub python cage needs, I kind of give that size as what I say is a very comfortable minimum for them. I don't think I would go below that size for a full-grown adult Amethystina or Clastolepis. But I think that cage size is great. But if you want to go bigger than that, go crazy with it. I have my biggest cages are 8 feet long, or 8 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 3 feet tall. And my biggest scrub python looks small in there to me. So I think those cages are tremendous for the snakes, particularly for males. I keep females in cages that size as well. And frankly, I just don't see them moving around quite that often, where they could be in that 6 foot cage and literally be doing the exact same types of behaviors. The males, on the other hand, they will be all over those cages, especially during season when they're cruising. They're exploring every single inch of those 8 foot cages. So I definitely like having those males in those big cages for that exact purpose. I personally, I don't like cages that are more than 2 feet deep. I don't know, make fun of me all you want. I just don't like reaching deep into an enclosure. My only cages in the entire house that are deeper than 2 feet are my Mengshan Viper cages, which are 30 inches deep. And, I don't really reach into those cages much to begin with anyway. I'm using my big grabber tongs. So the extra 6 inches of depth doesn't really bother me. But, you can obviously go deeper on these scrub python cages. I'm not going to discourage anybody from doing that. The amount of extra cubic footage that comes from an extra 6 inches of depth in an enclosure, when you do the math, it's actually a lot more significant than you would really think. So definitely not discouraging from that at all. Go taller. If you want a 7 foot tall cage, go crazy. They'll use it, especially males. The only thing that comes into play there is just kind of the heating dynamics of that enclosure. If it's in a room that isn't at a higher ambient temperature, just making sure that the animal has access to the basking spot, can actually fully get their body under the basking spot, and then wherever they might be hiding on the floor or whatever isn't too cold for what you would want for that snake. If that basking spot that's 6 feet in the air is 95 degrees, okay, cool. But if the floor is sitting at 65, you're not doing right by that animal. That animal is staying too much on the cold side. So the enclosure is really all about a few things: functionality for yourself in the space you're working with, and then obviously the health and well-being of the animal, having the enclosure big enough to where the animal can move around, stretch out, perform natural behaviors, but then also that you're able to maintain the husbandry of the animal as well, maintain the temperature, the humidity, and first and foremost, prioritize the health of the animal over what looks good in an enclosure. I think that's oftentimes overlooked, especially sometimes these days with people who are, I guess, how to put this nicely, they maybe put emotions over facts when it comes to how they set up their reptiles. Do all these nice things for your animals, go crazy. More power to you. I'll never discourage anyone from doing that. But as soon as you start to compromise the well-being of that animal for an enclosure that you feel better about personally, you're doing it all wrong. So on that slightly controversial comment. We're about at the midway point of the show, maybe a little bit past it. I'm going to run a quick commercial. Sit tight, everybody. I'll be back here very shortly.
For the #1 PVC enclosures in the reptile game, no better place to visit than Focus Cube Habitats. Excited for today's sponsor, Focus Cube Habitats, #1 enclosures in the reptile game by far. Everything you see behind me are 3x2x2 PVC design enclosures by Steven and Ashley over at Focus Cube Habitats. They're based out of Texas. If you head over to their website, you can select from over 30 plus different enclosure designs that they've done. Two of the hardest working people in the reptile hobby today, and I'm so excited to add more Focus Cube enclosures. So much again, Steve and Ashley, I appreciate the 5+ years of partnerships that we've had together. Looking forward to growing more. Head over to focuscubedhabitats.com, head over to their YouTube channel, subscribe, and check them out on Instagram. Thank you so much, Focus Cube Habitat. When you think about building a good community and being a leader of that community, nobody comes to mind better than Mark Hager over at Texas CHONDROS. That's right. Make sure you head over to TX CHONDROS on Instagram and also head over to Mark's website, see what he has available green tree python wise, and be ready for quite the 2025 green tree python breeding season out of Mark Hager. He's a veteran in the green tree python game, one of the best and nicest breeders in the green tree python game. He's been putting on the whole state of Texas for as long as I've known him. So if you want to see all the amazing other chondro keepers out of the state of Texas, another good reason to go follow Mark Hager over at TX Chondros on Instagram. And again, head over to his website, texaschondros.com. You can find all the links in the description below. Thank you so much, Mark Hager, for supporting the trap. Cheers.
Alrighty, we are back from the commercial break. I don't know how you guys all feel about it. I personally love the commercial breaks. Having a few minutes in the middle of the show to stretch out, take a drink of water, and refocus has been absolutely lovely. So huge shout out to MJ for this new format. It benefits the host greatly. Anyway, back to the conversation. So Emmy asks a great question about in the ambient rooms, for bottom enclosures, putting them, sitting on like foam board or something like that, something to, keep that cage warmer despite being in a position inevitably to be cooler than the rest of the enclosures. And my answer, like with a lot of this, is it really depends on the room, but yeah, in a lot of cases, something like that is a good thing to do. Depends on your climate as well. So I personally right now don't have any enclosures that I have on, foam board or on spacers or anything like that from the floor. But any bottom cages that I have in rooms that are on the ground floor of the house, they have supplemental heating elements in the enclosures. And then being where we are here in Texas during the summer, that floor is still going to be pretty warm. So, in my adult scrub python room where I have both the ability to run everything on ambient and to use supplemental heating during the summer, I cut all the heat panels in the room, run it just on the mini split in the room, and the bottom cages do just fine on the full ambient. But again, this comes down to how your room is set up. If you're in a more northern climate, that might be a lot more important for you as well to not have that cage directly on the floor. But then if you are really in a cold area, I would say that those are probably enclosures that are going to need some sort of supplemental heat on them. But anyway, great question though. So next topic on the list. I covered it a little bit already, but we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive, and that's into feeding with these snakes. I think that this is an incredibly important topic, and maybe the most important topic when it comes to scrub pythons for a few reasons. They need a lot of food, and they also need not a lot of food. That sounds ridiculous, but with a little bit of explanation, I think it'll make a little bit of sense. So I'll premise this by kind of do a little bit of a brief history that I probably say on here over and over again. But as many of us know who have been around for a while, the good old days of reptiles, everything got fed a lot. There's the guy from Southern California method of, feed the snakes until they die of obesity, or the ball python, a medium rat every week for the thing's entire life. and snakes became morbidly obese. So there was an effort by people like Dave and Tracy Barker and Terry Phillip to spread awareness about this issue and try to correct it. And, those three who I just named are absolute experts, legends of the industry, people who I look up to with the utmost respect. That message was taken and it was skewed to a very extreme by a group of python enthusiasts, I guess I will say. This kind of, at least in my estimation, kind of happened in like the early 2010s. And I think we are just now in the last few years getting to a point of finally coming back to center a little bit. So yes, it was much needed to have an overall correction of how we feed our pythons and boas in captivity to backing off on them. But there is some nuance to it. So scrub pythons, I treat how I feed them based on their age and their size. And I'll kind of break down exactly what I mean by that. So they are definitely prone to obesity and they are prone to complications from it, but only really once they reach adulthood and adult size. So once I have a scrub python, let's just start with a male. Once I have a male scrub python, that's to the point where he's eating like a jumbo rat, where I'm like, okay, this is an adult. He'll never get a prey item bigger than this in his entire life, more than likely. To me, that animal eats at most once a month and potentially every 6 weeks over the summer. And then we'll get 3 months of fasting in the late fall into winter. So a big adult male scrub python might get 5 or 6 meals a year sometime, especially if he's not breeding. Well, if you treated a yearling like that, you would kill that snake. So there is a nuanced approach you must take when feeding scrub pythons. I am personally of the belief with these snakes, really with all snakes, but particularly with scrub pythons for a very specific reason, that the first year of their life dictates the remainder of their life from a health standpoint, and particularly when it comes to feeding. So I've raised up a lot of baby scrub pythons by now, and I've also raised up baby scrub pythons I've raised a lot that I produced. I've raised a decent amount that others have produced as well. And I have experimented with different methods of feeding from the ones that I produced. And then I've also dealt with animals that were fed by other people in ways that they thought was most appropriate. And I guess to go over some of the potential methods, the method that I use now is I really feed them, I don't want to say as much as possible, but like pretty dang close in the first year of their life, where they're getting a weekly meal that leaves a significant lump in them, and trying to get that snake to grow as much as it possibly can in the first year of its life within reason. So, not keeping that snake full constantly. It's not getting, 2-3 items at a time to where it's bursting at the seams, but it's not getting a fuzzy mouse when it can handle like a 6-gram fuzzy mouse when it can handle a 13-gram small to medium mouse. It's getting that small to medium mouse that's going to be a test to its system and will inevitably create a growth pattern in that animal. The main thing that made me realize this was acquiring a collection, of scrub pythons of all different ages from somebody who was, known as one of the top people who was working with these snakes, who had a very different approach to raising babies, where he would give them a small meal every 3 weeks as neonates. And many of those neonates that I acquired from this individual are no longer with me because they have died of a number of different complications along the way. The primary one being cancer, that I think I can equate to poor nutrition and malnutrition at a young age. So these animals were getting small meals very infrequently, and were getting primarily birds as feeders. So for a baby scrub python, the bird that you're feeding that thing has maybe been alive for a few hours before, before it gets frozen off, and not eating on its own. So you're just really deriving nutrition from the yolk that is in the bird's belly, which isn't terrible. But and this will get into another conversation about types of feeders for scrub pythons. But that's really not a very nutritious meal for that snake, especially with low frequency. So these snakes are most certainly prone to stunting and then major complications with stunting. Some species can be stunted intentionally and then kind of recover later, namely reticulated pythons, and that's kind of been a way to market some of the new age dwarf, super dwarf things, is to basically stunt animals and then fake market them as adults to try to get people who should be keeping maybe ball pythons into keeping reticulated pythons. So one thing that as scrub pythons become more popular, some of the older school people are kind of worried about what that could mean for the future of the genus complex from a lot of different perspectives. I think one aspect of this that kind of is going to be a bit of a protection from any of those potential issues is the fact that you really can't stunt a scrub python without shortening its life dramatically. If you decide to feed this animal super sparingly when it's young, it's probably not going to make it to 10 years old. It'll never reach adult size. It'll have health issues, and it'll be a terrible thing all around in every way possible. So, but that said, though, I don't think you need to necessarily feed at a fever pitch when they're young if you don't want to. I'm still personally experimenting to figure out exactly what I think is best for them. These are just kind of my findings so far. I think no matter what you do, whether or not you feed with a higher frequency or a lower frequency, without question, larger meals are so much better for these snakes than smaller meals in absolutely every way possible. I've personally I've inadvertently run these experiments where the first clutch of scrub pythons that I ever produced were back in 2020. I just fed them smaller meals when they were younger, just because I thought that's what you were supposed to do with them. And I look back now at pictures from when they were 2 years old, and I almost cringe at the pictures. They almost look like sickly to me. They have like heads that are proportionally too big for their body and skinny bodies. I'm very fortunate that I don't think I did so poorly with them that they were beyond the point of no return, where these animals are adult size now and they're breeding and they're doing great. Their body proportions are back to what I think is a normal state. So I'm glad on that. But then looking at 2-year-olds that I've been raising on larger meals, they're a lot bigger and they have very healthy body proportions. They have very good musculature. Their head is proportionate to their body. Everything just looks right with this snake. And I primarily equate that to the larger meal size in them. I think if you feed a scrub python up until breeding size adults, where there's some variety when it comes to meal size with them that can be important for breeding, I believe. But I would say up until the point where a scrub python is eating a jumbo rat, if you are feeding that snake and you're not seeing a lump in its belly, you need to increase the prey size instantly, or you're gonna have problems potentially arise with that animal. So that's kind of my gauge of how I feed my scrub pythons. If I feed this rodent and it leaves a lump, cool, I'll feed it the same size next time. Once that snake reaches the size where that food item really isn't doing much for it, it gets bumped up. I personally will do a weekly feeding schedule for my scrub pythons, aside from tandem bars. That's so different topic on tandem bars. I guess I'll cover that a bit in a second. I'm still very much in the learning process with feeding my tandem bars, but with amethystina, with clastolepis, and then even with Tracia, I'm feeding them weekly meals up until the point where they're eating medium rats. And that, depending on the species, I would say for clastolepis and amethystina, you're looking at 2.5 to 3 years on that. And then for Tracia, you're probably looking more like 4 years. to get to that size. So, and people would hear that, some python breeders, and tell you that I'm creating obese snakes. I'm abusing my animals. And then my response to that would be, if I put this snake in your hand and told you it was 5 years old, you would be like, oh, wow, this thing looks great. And then if I came back, well, actually, this snake is only 2 years old. Are you going to change your idea on what a healthy snake looks like just because the number is different on its age? Or was the original judgment of the snake's body composition really what you were looking at from the standpoint of health, and then any sort of preconceived notions that then got in the way after that, to kind of tell you what or what not the snake should be at this age, just because you think it shouldn't be this big yet, even though it isn't the pinnacle of health. So maybe I have a little bit of anger about that topic. So let's bring it back to center a little bit. I'll take a swig of my water. Anyway, though, once I reach the size of eating medium rats, then I back them off to an every other week feeding schedule. With that said, though, when they're younger, it's not every week, militantly, no matter what. I'll be traveling one week and I don't feed my collection because I don't want anything to go wrong associated with that feeding once I leave, or the snake will be in shed and it won't want to eat, or I run out of feeders that week and I'm just waiting until next week. So there'll be some variety. And I think that, having a regimented feeding schedule is not the best when you're doing this, full time and with a collection size that I do, and when your brain works the way that mine does. If I was feeding on a more randomized schedule, this place would be an absolute disaster. So I need to do it for the sake of making sure that everybody stays as good as possible. But for anything that I'm throwing a more varied schedule in, they'll get 2 weeks on, 1 week off, or if they're on a more infrequent feeding schedule, 3 weeks between meals, then 4 weeks, then 6 weeks, then back to 3 weeks or something like that. So, I think some of that is definitely called for when it comes to raising scrub pythons as well, not to just have them on this like factory assembly line feeding schedule. But as a general rule, I just like to get those calories in these kind of regular intervals when they're young, just to promote what I think is the most healthy growth pattern for these snakes. But once I hit the medium rats, I will take them back to a less frequent feeding schedule, every other week, maybe throw them every third week every now and then, give them a back-to-back to see if you can, create a little bit of a growth spurt with the influx of calories, stuff like that. Once they hit the size of eating large rats, then I back them off to every third week. And as you can guess, jumbo rats, probably about an average of once a month. But then once they hit jumbo rats, then their breeding size, even sometimes with the large rats, with some of the smaller amethystina or with the halmaheras, a large rat is pretty much going to be their ultimate prey size as an adult. So then they'll get into more of a cycle feeding schedule for breeding. Let's see, reading Mason's comment. Do you think yeah, so I think that both are factors. I think the irregularity, just from the standpoint of keeping those biological functions healthy and keeping that snake as natural as you can, is probably important. But then, yeah, I mean, the body composition is really the most important aspect to look at. I should probably preface this all by saying that this feeding schedule is for that of a captive bred baby scrub python that I've raised from a baby. Once you're getting into wild caught animals, or animals that you might have acquired at an older age that were not in the best of condition, then that changes up a bit. So I guess to just kind of talk about that, since I just mentioned it, let's say I were to get in a wild caught scrub python about 5 feet long or so, a juvenile animal. This animal is probably 2 to 3 years old. But it's been through a lot. It's been picked out of the wild, gone to the collector's facility, then gone to the exporter, then gone to the importer in the US. And then if I'm lucky that those are the minimum steps possible before it comes to me, it might even change hands 2 or 3 more times beforehand. The animal has been significantly dehydrated in the process, malnourished. It may not have been fed in any of these places. Now you're looking at a very different feeding type of schedule. And actually, I think I do have later on in the episode, a bit of a topic of the wild caught animals. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, body composition for sure has a major aspect of it as well, especially once you get to larger animals. If you have a big adult that's healthy and has good weight on it, and you feed that thing every 3 weeks, you're going to end up with an obese snake in no time at all. So as the kind of chronology of this discussion goes on, once you hit that large rat size, this is when you're getting to like a young adult scrub python. And then now you've reached the point where you actually can make the snake fat and cause complications. I think that getting to this point in an effective, I don't want to say fast way, but in a way where you're not really wasting your time, I think is very important. I think growing these snakes up at a slow rate can potentially negate their ability to ever breed. I think there are examples of scrub pythons that are in some captive collections that are old and small that, every year is like, man, why hasn't this guy gotten a clutch yet? Or I can't wait for this pair to produce. And it's like, well, you kind of have juvenile size snakes that are 12 years old, and these females will never have the fat reserves necessary to carry a clutch. Their biology physically is not large enough to even have this internal space for a healthy scrub python egg. I think that's the part that blows my mind the most is when some of these, python people who preach, keep them small, keep them small, keep them small. It's like, do you know how big the eggs are that this species produces? Like, I think you would at least want the snakes large enough to carry the eggs of their own species. For anyone who hasn't seen them, which is probably a lot of people, scrub python eggs and ball python eggs are pretty much indistinguishable from one another. A lot of people have seen ball python eggs, and they're significantly sized. So if you look at the back end of your scrub python and can't imagine a shape about that large, width-wise, and for probably about half the length of the snake's body, you probably don't have a big enough snake to breed, just based on volume of body. Like, I don't know, to me, that's just really straightforward and simple. And to me, that size on a scrub python, for an amethystina or a clastolepis, the larger scrub pythons, is about 7 to 8 feet long on the low end. And then, to the size where they're eating a decent sized large rat with pretty much with relative ease. To put that in a gram weight, I would say like 200 to 225 gram rats. If they're taking those down with ease, you probably have a scrub python that is big enough to breed. If you're looking at the Halmaheras, I would say maybe closer to the 175 mark or 185 on the large rats. And then Tannenbars, significantly smaller than that. I mean, from what I've seen, I personally have never bred Tannenbars, but I've seen Tannenbar females sitting on clutches that probably couldn't even take down a decent sized medium rat. So you're looking at an entirely different scenario with the Tannenbar scrubs, just considering they're significantly smaller than the rest of these guys. Once you reach that stage where they're eating those large rats to those jumbo rats, now you're really having to watch what you're feeding the snake and prevent it from becoming obese. So I think the best way to do that is to feed these animals seasonally. So for me personally, I have been over the last few years, and I think with some pretty decent success, to the point where I'm going to continue to do this until my data says otherwise, is putting them through a 3-month fast in the winter. You will hear people say, do a 6-month fast. I know one breeder in the UK who will do a 6-month fast with his scrub pythons and get repeat clutches from his one female. But then during the warm months when he's feeding them, he's feeding that snake constantly. So he's really jamming all that nutrition, that fat building into a shorter window. So then the fasting period kind of evens it all out. All the nutrients are already there for breeding, and the snakes are able to go through the process in a healthy way. More power to you if you do that method. I've been doing a 3-month fast with some pretty good success, and then off season, it depends on the animal, but I guess let's say for adult males, they don't really need to eat all that frequently in general total. For really big older males that are, let's say 10 foot plus long, I mean, every 6 to 8 weeks during the warmer months, a jumbo rat or larger, I think is plenty for them. You know, you can gauge these snakes on their body composition pretty easily once they get bigger. The main sign that I look for that they're getting a little fat is you'll see like excess buildup of what probably is fat tissue at the base of the jaw, basically like the top of the neck of the snake, more or less. So if you get to the point of of having a snake, a big adult scrub python that is showing some of these signs of being overweight, probably good to cut back the food. Another thing that you can do, at least I think you can do, I haven't really tried this exactly, but I'm curious to, if you have a snake that is overweight, is not to just completely cut off the feeding, because as we all know, snakes have this kind of uncanny ability to almost totally cut off their metabolism and maintain on their body mass for a really, really long time. I think what actually could be a very good strategy for weight loss is to feed regular meals, but just feed really small regular meals. So like if this snake can take a jumbo rat, give it a medium rat, make that metabolism kick in, make those body functions go, but then have the calorie input be so little to where the amount expended to process that item, to digest it, for all the organs to fire, will actually require more energy than the feeder is giving that snake, and therefore is actually forcing the animal to start eating away at the fat tissue. Potentially could be a way to actually have a snake lose weight faster than just totally cutting it off of food. With that said, I think the better plan is to not get that snake to be fat in the first place. So from an age standpoint, I would say you're looking at probably about a 6 to 7 year old scrub python before you're really cutting back to a minimal feeding schedule. But then at that point, that becomes very important, because that is the age where you can start to get these things kind of fat. For a younger male, let's say an 8 to 10 foot male that's eating like a jumbo rat, I would say roughly outside of cooling period, like a once a month meal is pretty good for that snake. It'll continue to grow at a moderate pace. You keep the animal hungry. A hungry male is probably going to be one that's a little bit more prone to breed, but with, very strong musculature, generally speaking, a very good body composition. And then for the females, during breeding season, I like to feed them a little bit more. I like to give them a meal about every 3rd week during breeding season. One that's substantial, but not going to leave some giant lump in them to where, especially if a female is developing follicles, where the needs biologically are put so much towards the digestion of the food that the follicles get neglected or whatnot. Just kind of enough to maintain the biological process and then input those calories to grow the follicles, to grow the fat reserves if needed, and to push that female through the process of developing her follicles into ovulation and then gestation as well. So the biggest factor when it comes to off-season feeding of females is whether or not that female laid eggs. I have screwed this up significantly, where I've had females that I have fed up to breed, they did not breed, and then I continued to feed them normally during the summer. And now I have a fat snake. I've had female scrub pythons that have laid a clutch and look like they didn't lay a clutch afterward. And I'm like, that's probably not good. So if you put a female through the motions of feeding them to breed and they don't breed, that snake might get 2-3 meals until cool down happens. Just try to clear out the system, not put on any additional weight, maybe even do what I was saying about the small meals to try to force some weight loss. If a female gets to that point where you had her at a healthy body weight before the cool down, before breeding season, you fed her to breed and she did nothing, there's a lot of excess calories that are going to be there, which is good for you at that point from like a, the standpoint of how much effort is going to go into maintaining the snake, because it really doesn't need to eat all that much until breeding time come the next year. But the mistake can come into where if you continue to feed that snake like your females who may have laid eggs or are younger, now you're going to end up with a fat adult female, and that's going to be a bad breeder and a snake that probably will run into health issues in the not too distant future, especially if that animal's already pushing like the 10-year mark or so. With that said, a female that does lay eggs, now you're treating that a bit differently, to where I personally like to start off with some small meals, kind of back to back off the start. For anyone who is out there who has bred scrub pythons, you know that after they lay their clutch, they can kind of look like a deflated tire sometimes, especially if it's a really big clutch. It can take a whole lot out of them. I mean, it's a slender python species that has a naturally low body fat content and can have decent sized clutches sometimes. So that snake, once it is done laying, it's going to has a lot taken out of it. For a typical big female, I'll give him like a big medium rat or a small large rat right off the like a week or two after she's done laying her eggs, and I take them. I don't think Paul is here anymore, but for any of you who listened to the episode with Paul Duran back over the summer, he maternally incubated his scrub pythons. And, the female showed some really interesting behaviors when it came to food. If I'm remembering properly, I think she ate a couple of times while she was incubating her clutch, and then kind of rode out the rest of it, staying with her clutch for the most part. And as soon as the babies were gone, she was right on it. So obviously when you artificially incubate the eggs, the female is kind of thrown for a bit of a loop because it completely throws off their natural cycle. But obviously, shortly thereafter, they're going to want food because naturally they're nothing else. They're not putting their effort into the eggs, and they would probably be eating anyway if they were, maternally incubating. So I'll give them a small meal to where it really doesn't leave much of a lump in them, just so they can handle it, get some calories in them, get that functionality of the body going again. Because at this point, the snake hasn't eaten for, at least probably 2.5 months, maybe even closer to 3 months, while losing potentially 30 to 50% of its body mass. So the snake is in a potentially delicate state. I think if you throw that thing a jumbo rat, the answer is probably that it wouldn't even eat it to begin with. And if it did, I would be very concerned, just considering how broken down the body systems are. So if it handles that medium to small, large rat, I'll give it 2 weeks later, 2 weeks later, and kind of do that, building up the prey size until I feel like the snake has regained a healthy body weight. I personally don't breed my females back-to-back years. If one is developing follicles and going through all the motions, I'll surely try. I just have yet to successfully produce a good clutch back-to-back from one female. I know people who have done it. It is completely possible. So not to discourage anybody from doing it. But I'm not always necessarily trying to beef a female back up to be ready to breed by the next winter. So I've definitely made this mistake before of feeding females up way too fast after they lay their eggs, and now I've run into issues of making them too big again, and back to the not so fun game of trying to have a scrub python lose weight, which is very difficult. But then once they're back up to size, I would say, you're looking at maybe a monthly meal, 4 to 5 weeks over the summer into fall until the cool down for a female that did lay a clutch once that she is back up to the point of having good, healthy body weights. So yes, Mason, I do change both temperatures and humidity with the fast. Humidity, I'll drop, and I'll also decrease my spraying to about once a week if I'm doing it twice a week, maybe off season in the summer and spring, and then 3 times during season. And then I'll drop the ambient humidity in the room, maybe like from 50 to 60% down to like 40 to 50. So not a major change, but enough to make a difference. And then with temperatures, the nights are probably going to fall from 68 to 72, and then day highs might be like 77, 78. So not a huge change, but enough to where the snakes will obviously notice it. If in the summer their highs are getting to 84 and they're maybe getting 79 at night, that winter change is definitely going to be significant. So now with feeding out of the way, a couple of things I want to talk about. So I have my little notes. It said common ailments, and as I was making my outline for the show, I realized this is one of my favorite aspects of scrub pythons, is that they really are very hardy when it comes to, if you were to, I literally made a list of common ailments, and I had one that was common and one that was not common. The common one is that of skin problems. So while I have been continuously saying that scrub pythons are very hardy, they can put up with a lot of different care parameters. The one thing that you really can't mess with too much is stagnant moisture and like dirty conditions that they are kind of forced to sit in. I really don't like using paper more than I have to, especially in tubs or anything that's less ventilated, because anything where it's too wet sitting for a longer period of time, scrub pythons are much quicker to develop blisters and scale rot than a lot of other snake species. With that said, though, most cases of any sort of skin ailments can be pretty easily remedied at home without the need of veterinary attention by primarily just really drying the snake out. Give it maybe limited access to a water bowl if the issue came from a snake repeatedly spilling a water bowl, or something like that. The process of them shedding their skin really takes care of a lot of those issues of skin imperfections. So if you can dry a snake out and get it to a shed, kind of do a combination of dry enclosure, soak, dry enclosure, soak, then that can be a pretty good routine for getting rid of a blister outbreak or something like that. Soaking them in iodine, betadine water is definitely a good step as far as keeping those blisters or the rot sterile, starting to treat it. If you have access to silver sulfadazine, that's also great as well for any sort of skin imperfections. So, pretty standard treatments. But then the main thing is really just keeping that snake dry and getting it to its next shed cycle. I've had a decent number of scrub pythons over the years develop skin problems that I've treated. Almost entirely they've been wild caught, even though I have had it happen once or twice with captive bred animals, and never once have I needed to have any sort of veterinary intervention on skin problems, which I'm very grateful for. So the one major thing to watch out for with scrub python care is preventing skin issues like blisters or scale rot. The only other thing that I could think of are respiratory infections, which are super uncommon. I mean, I've had hundreds of scrub pythons, and I've had 3 scrub pythons with respiratory infections ever. And one was pretty early on in my scrub keeping days. Treated it with antibiotics, and it was good. 2 of them actually happened not all that long ago. I had a pair that was together for breeding, and for whatever reason, they both developed respiratory infections, or what symptomatically looked like respiratory infections. And I put them in the incubator at 88 degrees for a while. And another thing that might actually need to have Brooke on here at some point to talk about it, but what she does is diffuses chamomile tea in a fogger and kind of has the snake in a contained area with the diffused tea. It seems to really work for clearing up respiratory infections. A number of treatments on this pair of snakes, coupled with the dry heat of the incubator at about 88 degrees for a couple of weeks, cleared up both of the respiratory infections, and the snakes didn't look too great when they went into that incubator. And now you would have no idea that they ever had that issue to begin with. So, again, I was lucky to be able to fix that without veterinary intervention. And this is not even necessarily to talk negatively on veterinary medicine, but especially if for those of you who watched the Terry episode yesterday, to come to find out that the kidneys can contain or make up to 14% of the total volume of a snake. These antibiotics take a massive toll on the kidneys of these snakes. Considering how much of the body that is, with any reptile, particularly any snake, I would say avoid antibiotics at all costs if you can. Obviously, if something really bad is happening with your snake and you need antibiotics, use them. They're there for that purpose. But I think any scenario where you can avoid antibiotics to treat a snake, do it. So then when you really do need those antibiotics, the antibiotics will actually work, and the kidneys aren't going to be in a compromised state from having previously been exposed to the antibiotics. Okay, so yeah, interesting. Brandon said he's done Vicks vapor rub in a hot cup of water with a snake inside. Very cool. Yeah, so then another cool at-home remedy for respiratory infection. So for an hour and 45 minutes of me rambling about scrub pythons, the common ailments segment took maybe less than 10, which to me is a great thing because it speaks to the resiliency of these animals. Obviously, with that said, though, they're still susceptible to all the viruses and ailments that any snake can potentially get. So no matter where a snake is coming from, I'd recommend getting a panel test done on it before you clear it from quarantine in your setup. If you are a keeper and a breeder, as I've discussed on here before, plenty of episodes, but particularly the one with Alex Myers, where we went over a lot of our tips and tricks and tools that we use for our collections. The order of operations is the most ultimate way to kind of maintain biosecurity within your own collection. For me, the babies that I produced, they all get cared for first. They get, if I'm using feeding tongs to feed animals, as soon as I have a fresh pair of tongs, they get their food first with those tongs. I never go from the adults back to the babies. And if, when I do, typically there's a shower and a change of clothes in between. So, this is a bit of a diversion from the actual topic, but order of operations is of the absolute utmost importance with really any reptile. Brandon, you're one step ahead of me. The last topic is, in fact, establishing wild caught. So everybody, my director, Brandon Valentine, keeping me on track here. I couldn't do it without you, Brandon. So yes, the last topic of the night is establishing wild caught scrub pythons. Majority of this conversation has been more slated towards captive bred scrub pythons for a few reasons. Obviously, one of them is that, it's what I'm doing. I'm trying to provide and make more captive bred scrub pythons. But truly these days, amazingly enough, there are many more captive bred scrub pythons available than wild caught scrub pythons, which is something that, the hobby probably never thought that it would be able to say. And I'm very, very grateful that we are able to say that now. But if you go on to MORPH market, if you go to a show, you're going to see more captive bred scrub pythons now than wild caught. So, which is great for new keepers, because it is far and away the better option to go for, a ton of different reasons that I've been over on countless occasions on this channel. But with that said, wild caught scrub pythons are very important for a lot of reasons. One, obviously, how we got here was from wild caught scrub pythons. And then from the standpoint of bolstering captive genetics and on rarer localities as well, that as of now, we are still entirely dependent on wild caught animals to establish those lines. These animals are very important. So when I get in a wild caught scrub python, I'm a little bit more regimented on them than what I've been saying for some of the parameters on the captive bred scrub pythons. They go into a quarantine tub setup, very simple. So you typically on paper, so I can really monitor the snake in an ambient room. And for the most part, I'm just leaving this animal alone. So the most important aspect is about getting them onto food, basically as quickly as you possibly can. Most, if not all, wild caught scrub pythons will come in some sort of a poor shape, to where they're dehydrated or they're a little bit thin or whatnot. So once I get food into them, I keep getting food into them. I'll start with a smaller prey item to where it's not really going to leave much of a lump in the snake. A meal that it'll be able to take very easily, digest, process with maximum efficiency. And then, just let it complete the process, let it poop out the waste, and kind of be back at square one and see how the animal handles the whole process. And then feed it again. When I have wild caught animals that I'm establishing, really until their body condition is almost indistinguishable from some of my captive bred stock, I feed the snakes weekly. And I don't really often give them big meals, especially if they're in ambient rooms with maybe a bit of a lower temperature where I don't necessarily think that the conditions are the greatest for digesting large meals. I'll kind of continue to give them some smaller meals, but with more frequency, just so the calories are coming in. Just getting some weight and size on that snake. A big topic when it comes to wild caught snakes in general is that of parasite treatment, of running panicure and flagell through an animal. All snakes have some level of a parasite load, naturally speaking. So, you're not really gonna ever fully get rid of it, and maybe you even shouldn't. There's obviously a lot of good gut bacteria, gut flora that those treatments would kill as well. So, you want to consider that in your equation. I personally don't treat any wild caught animals unless it seems completely necessary. And oftentimes if that does happen, it's even years down the line when I'm like, okay, maybe this is time to hit it with one round of this or that. And we briefly talked about this, about emerald tree boas on one of the Chris Rice episodes, that he doesn't do any treatments with his wild caught emeralds either. He just does a very extended quarantine period separate from the rest of his collection. And the thing is, with these wild caught animals, you really are going to kind of treat them differently for the entirety of their life. I guess you probably should. I typically like to have my wild caught scrub pythons in quarantine for, probably like at least a year before I introduce them into my other rooms, just to make sure this animal is really, really solid in every way possible. And then I'll typically do some viral test. Well, not typically, I'll always do some viral testing as well before bringing that animal into the room. It's a great question about price differences on wild caught and captive bred. So yeah, of course, there's going to be a price bump between a wild caught and a captive bred. It can be more significant for some types than others, like the Maruki Southerns and Tanamera Southerns. They're pretty commonly bred these days, and captive bred individuals are not the priciest. There's going to be a bit of a price jump, but not nearly as extreme as you would get with Barnecks or Halmaheras, Malukans, Orange Highlands, some of those types that you can see a pretty significant price difference. I think that, and then Brandon makes a great point. It also depends on who's selling it and if they know what they're even selling, because a lot of times some of these importer flipper people will get scrub pythons and they'll pay the retail price of however much for this scrub python, and they don't really know exactly what's going on. They just know it's a scrub python, and some people on the internet like them, and I can double my money on this thing. But I think that the price difference is actually very important to promote a good, healthy market, but then also have it not be so extreme of a price difference to where somebody's like, okay, well, I'm not going to pay 3 to 4 times for a captive bred what I will for this wild caught animal, because that seems completely insane. But if that markup is 30 to 40% or 25% or whatever it may be, then I think, it's showing that there is a difference between this wild caught and this captive bred animal, but the price difference is not so extreme to where you wouldn't consider ponying up for the healthier animal. And then if you also consider as a customer, if I buy this wild caught animal that has a significantly lower chance of thriving and I lose it and I buy another one, well, now I've spent more money than I did on the captive bred animal. But if you could buy 4 of them before you hit the price of one captive bred, then I assume that captive bred animal is going to sit there available for a really long time. So yeah, typical ranges in price. I would say overall for scrub pythons, like the lowest you would ever see is like around the $300 range. And that's, you're looking at like wild caught Maruki Southerns from a seller who really doesn't care about what they're doing and just trying to move animals. The absolute high end of the scrub python range are going to be captive bred Moluccan scrub pythons, probably in like the $4,000 range for an individual. And then majority of them would fall into like the $750 to $2,500 range for an individual. And that I would say for captive bred animals. I don't personally think a wild caught scrub python of any kind should be more than like $1,200 to $1,500, depending on locality. Wild caught Moluccans are typically more than that. The last ones that were made publicly available were $2,500 a piece, which I think was far too high. But again, I don't know what they were getting them landed for. And considering that there had been no availability for a couple of years, demand was inevitably higher. So the sellers could get more for those snakes than they had put into them significantly. So that's kind of the deal with those. But then, when you talk captive bred Barnecks, Orange Highlands, Halmaheras, Arus, some of the ones that are not quite as frequently bred, Tannenbaras probably, I would say for those animals, you're looking probably at a typical range of like $1,500 to $2,000 a piece, some falling below that range, and then really exceptional animals going above that range, generally speaking, is what I kind of, my thoughts on it. And then, yeah, Lisa, this is perfect. So yeah, she said her mantra with wild caught scrubs is keep the stress low, hands off, no cameras in their face. And yeah, that's really it. Keep them in a setup where they're not going to be seeing a bunch of movement all the time. If it's in a quarantine room that you go in once a day, maybe that's, not, I'm not going to say dark, but like not super bright and, low activity level, calm, quiet. It's exactly what you want for a wild caught scrub. With all this stuff said, wild caught scrubs are not particularly hard to establish compared to other wild caught snakes, with 2 exceptions. But I mean, I have many scrubs in my collection that are wild caught. I mean, all of my breeders that created my founder stock that I have, they were all wild caught. So I'm not talking down on wild caught. I think captive bred are a lot better, but they're not like, it's not night and day difference. A wild caught scrub python that has been well established, well cared for, raised up from a younger size, if you put that next to a captive bred animal of the same size, to the untrained eye, you probably can't tell much of a difference, but that is obviously best case scenario for a wild caught scrub python. The 2 exceptions to that rule are Halmaheras and Biocs. They are very sensitive from when they come in. They don't like to eat right away. They hide constantly. Bioc scrub pythons historically have a very high failure rate in captivity, higher than that of Halmaheras. I mean, the main reason why Halmahera scrubs took so long to be successfully bred in captivity is that they were being brought in as wild caughts that were older and they just did not establish. It really took younger wild caught animals to come in to people who were willing to raise them up for 5, 6, 7 years before breeding them, and had the patience to see the project through to where that actually worked out well. So I would say if you're a Halmahera fan, I very much encourage you to wait for captive bred animals to become available. Definitely go for the wild caught. Just have your expectations in check, and potentially be ready for a difficult process, and be prepared to lose the animals as well in the worst case scenario. So good question about, do females sell for more than males? Yeah, definitely. With scrub pythons, I would say, generally speaking, females sell for more than males. And honestly, it'll really come down most of the time to the breeder and the ratio of babies that they have available. It's much more common for a breeder to be male heavy than female heavy, and I know that very well personally. So it can vary from year to year as well. If a couple of, let's say in the US in 2025, there are 3 people who produce Orange Highland scrub pythons. And of those 3 clutches, 70% of them are males. You might see those males at half the price of the females, and then females only sold in pairs. But then that's because of the availability in the market for that year. So it definitely, it's not a kind of hard and fast, cut and dry type of situation. But if you generalize it, males definitely sell for less than females, which I think actually can also be kind of a good thing for anybody who wants just like a pet scrub python. I personally think male scrub pythons make better pets than female scrub pythons for one reason alone, and that is that as they get bigger, males are more active than females in a display enclosure. So I think if you want a big, active, displaying snake, I think a male scrub python is a much better option than a female scrub python. Within reason, of course. It's not a very dramatic difference, but significant enough to where I notice it day to day as a keeper and a breeder, someone who has a lot of these snakes, and to where I tell that to people when they are inquiring about, I want a pet scrub python. I tell them, generally speaking, I think males are a little bit better than females. And if I had to generalize temperament as well, I would say males across the board have a little bit of a better temperament than females. But then again, I have dozens of female scrub pythons that are puppy dog tame. So it's a generalization within reason as well. So let's see. Okay. So the last kind of thing I had about the wild caught scrub pythons is about breeding them to captive bred scrub pythons. I think it's very important, and I think it should be done. But the only thing that you would want to consider at that point is that captive bred animal that's been involved in that pairing with the wild caught. You kind of need to consider that animal, not consider it wild caught, but maybe not quite consider it in the discussion as your pure captive bred stock that has never come across a wild animal. Just from a parasite standpoint, from whatever it may be, these snakes are they're healthy and they're resilient, but you just could potentially run into an issue where, worst case scenario, let's say you have a captive bred female that you've raised up, she's 7 years old, you pair her up with a wild caught male, great, you get a clutch from them. 2 years later, now you have a captive bred male that you breed to that same female, and now he ends up with a case of parasites. 1 + 1 = 2. Wild caught snake, parasites got contracted by the female, and then she passed it along to that captive bred male down the line. So potential issues that could arise, especially if you're doing viral testing and proper quarantine, the likelihood of something dramatic happening is very, very low. But still, I think just something to have in your mind as you go about managing a collection that has both wild caught and captive bred scrub pythons as part of it. Oh man, 2 hours and 5 minutes of straight rambling to myself like a crazy person. huge shout out to everybody who has been in the live chat for the entirety of this show. Lots of awesome engagement. If there's any final questions before I sign off, drop them now because it is about time to wrap up. I really wanted to do this episode kind of as a not like a part two, but along with the video the podcast I did about all the different locality types, and then also my YouTube video that I did with all the locality types. Just as kind of like a scrub python starter kit, so to speak, for anybody who is interested in these snakes and is trying to find a good baseline of information. I think that this podcast and then the last solo one I did as well are a great starting point. It's kind of the resource that I wish that I had when I was first getting into these snakes. If these podcasts existed, it would have saved me years of trying to put all the pieces together on scrub pythons. So I'm very fortunate that I'm in the position to be able to do that. And hopefully as many people as possible can derive some positivity from it. So with all that said, I will kind of start the close out of the show. If any other comments hit the chat, I'll definitely get to them before I here's one right now. So a pet scrub python recommendation as a species, assuming that it's all captive bred. That's a great question. I don't really think you can go wrong. I would say more than the species or the locality. I would consider the temperament of the parents, actually. I have found that in the animals that I produce, that the behavior of the parents really dictates the behavior of the babies. Obviously, they can be worked with as well. If I had to go overall, just based on my breeding experience with a limited number of locality types, I've produced 4 different localities of scrub pythons. I would say across the board, the Barnecks have the best attitudes. With that said, my Orange Highland babies are all puppy dogs as well. But generally speaking, I would probably say Barnecks. But then really any of them can be great. I do personally believe that in 10 years, we may be looking at Halmahera scrubs as the most popular scrub python to keep in the US. They, generally speaking, have pretty good attitudes. They're slower moving generally than other scrub pythons. They stay a bit smaller in the long run than Amethystina and Clastolepis. So, I mean, if I were to have to answer this question specifically, I would say right now, I would probably say a Barneck. And then in the long run, I wouldn't be surprised if we were at some point saying Halmaheras to answer this question. Great question, though. Thank you very much for throwing that up there. So I guess, again, back to kind of doing some quick shout outs before close. For everyone here on YouTube on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, please subscribe to the channel. New podcasts drop every single day of the week from some of the absolute best guests in the industry, talking about some incredible topics, lots of different species of reptiles. So subscribe here, hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. So yeah, and that's kind of what I touched on briefly, Lisa, about the difference in the males and females. And then I think you definitely are right. Once they become mature, especially once they're breeding, you can kind of get the, bit of a hormonal shift with females during the course of the year. Actually, this is a great example. The female that's up in that cage right there, she's like a young adult right now. And she's captive bred. Come fall of last year, I mean, I raised her from about a yearling, and she is just total puppy dog, like any other captive bred Barneck. She was one that was kind of part of the stunted group that did well and took a long time to catch up to what I feel like is a healthy growth rate. So come fall time, once she got into that bigger cage, she was ready to grow, and she was hungry and angry all the time. This snake that I would let crawl around my neck and climb up on my head, I'm like, I don't want you within 4 feet of me because I think you're going to light me up. So I fed her, put her through cool down, and now she's back to the way she was. there probably is a correlation there, but that's not a shift that you're going to get with a male. The only, I mean, I don't even want to say as far as like a male might become a little bit more aggressive during breeding season. Personally, that's not even really my experience, but if you keep one male as a pet and he doesn't have the pheromones of females around, I would say there's no chance of that happening. So again, that's kind of another reason. And thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. That's another reason why I think that that male scrub pythons in general are probably better if you're picking an individual pet and you're deciding between a male and a female scrub python. Another reason why I would say probably if you're going to pick one or the other, I would pick a male. All right, so to go back to kind of the closeout things, the network is also available on audio platforms, like I said earlier in the show, Spotify, Apple, Buzzsprout, etc. Follow and a 5-star review on those sites would be incredible. For me, you can find me on Instagram at scrubshepherd, Stephen Kush on Facebook, Stephen Kush on YouTube. I drop a new video every Friday. This Friday, I'll be doing a video on some of my favorite raise up heavy patterned barneck scrub pythons that I have over here. Very excited to drop that video and show off some of my absolute favorite scrub pythons in my collection. So if you guys could subscribe there on my YouTube channel as well, I would be absolutely incredible. I would appreciate that very much so. I'm trying to be good about being consistent on the YouTube videos. So far, I've been doing what I set out to. So, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback from you guys. So, very much appreciate all of the support from the YouTube videos as well. I do have a Morph Market account now. It is Kush Reptile on Morph Market. I do have a few scrub pythons up on there now. So if this episode inspired you, maybe go check out the Morph Market. Another quick shout out to make at the end of the show as well. For any of you who loved this scrub python conversation, I would encourage you to check out the Somalia group on Facebook. Quite a few members of the group have been in the chat as well. Paul, Lisa, Brandon, Katie throughout the night, Emmy, a lot of really great people over there on the Somalia Facebook group, kind of our little grassroots scrub python Facebook group, with the main goal of providing great information and engaging conversation on these animals without gatekeeping in the community, where this group is open to absolutely anybody. You could be breeding scrub pythons for decades or have just heard about them yesterday and they piqued your interest. Everybody is welcomed. I am very proud to say that there is no bullying, talking down, no one's uppity on the group. There's, everyone who engages there, they know what the community is about, and we're all about cultivating good experiences and, promoting people who are interested in these snakes to pursue that interest. And a historic issue in scrub pythons has been gatekeeping by some, I hate to use this term, but by old timer type of people, even some new people who were not very friendly. So definitely a major goal was to eliminate that kind of dynamic. And I think we have done that very effectively over on the Somalia Facebook group. So that would be something that I would highly recommend you guys to check out if that is something of interest. Anyway, all of this rambling later. When is Scrub Fest? Oh, what a concept. Yeah, I actually think that would be freaking awesome. Like to do potentially Somalia Fest, even have it. I'm not going to, volunteer them, but if we have that at Reptilandia or something like that, try to get all of our Somalia, Bolins and scrub enthusiasts from the country into one place. That'd be freaking awesome. So yeah, I don't know, Lisa, just keep saying Scrub Fest or Somalia Fest over and over again, and maybe we can manifest it. Maybe it'll eventually happen one day. So yeah, that's a great point to end on. Let's make Somalia Fest a thing. All right. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight. I very much appreciate it. This was an awesome time. Thank you to everybody who was in the comments, and catch you all back here next week for a new episode.
Shout out to USARK and all USARK members. If you don't know what USARK is, don't be ashamed. Just go ahead and click the third link in the description below. See what USARK is all about, okay? You never know when legislations are going to hit your backyard, so that's why it's very important to consider becoming a USARK member today. These numbers really do matter, and they look at it for consideration when it comes to battling legislation. So first and foremost, thank you, Phil Goss. Thank you to anybody out there who partners up and volunteers with USARK organization. Thank you for anyone out there who's a USARK member. And if you can't become a USARK member today, please talk about it on your platforms. Let your neighbors know, let all your pet stores know what USARK is here for, and it's here to fight for our animal rights. Thank you to every USARK member and USARK supporter out there. True.